What difference does a change to your reserve funding goal make? How is your reserve funding plan affected when you adjust interest or inflation? And what does it look like when you phase out a project? We answer these questions in this segment of our Reserves in Real Life webinar. As we make changes to a reserve study for a 34-unit townhome, you'll see the types of decisions that are involved when we craft a reserve funding plan for your association.
And that brings us to the heart of our program today, diving into two different reserve studies. We're going to use our online reserve calculator tool, UPlanet, to show you what's going on. And the first one is going to be a townhome association built in 1979, so 40 plus years old, 34 units, 5 buildings, pool and spa, not too big, not too small, not too complex, but a nice typical association across the country. So Mark, ready to dive into looking at what this reserve study is and how we can talk about reserves in real life?
Hey, Robert. Yeah, I'm ready. Let's take a look.
Here we go. Okay, I'm going to crack open UPlanet. This is the screen that you'd be welcome to if you were a portfolio manager with a number of different associations on the system. So let's open up the 5-building townhome, open up UPlanet, and here we go. Starts with components. Then we have some financial information. Can deal with the funding plan, some custom work you can do here, and then all the tables and charts. But let's start with the components, which again are the foundation of every reserve study.
Yeah, Robert, I think everything is going to start with the components. What you guys are looking at here is you got your component names, so we can identify what we're looking at. You've got some quantities, tell us how much square footage or how many of an item you guys got. Useful life is what we expect out of a component when it's constructed correctly and under normal wear and tear. And then your remaining useful life is what's actually the ground truth. And then the current cost, that's the cost for the year of your study. There's a lot of different ways to work with these components to make sure that you guys have a good funding plan and that we have a good solid way forward for the association. One way we do that is through something called coordinated projects. You'll see asphalt here. Maybe when we're actually on the ground, the seal repair is holding up a little better than we thought, but we want to put some of these elements together to make sure that we don't do double work. So we coordinated some of these components and made it so that it all goes down at once. It does save the association a little bit of money to do it all at once, and it really cuts down on the inconvenience to homeowners, especially when you're dealing with something like asphalt. So that's one way we can make sure that we're flexible and make sure that we're getting a good plan for the homeowners association.
Yeah, basically trying to be wise. And one thing I was seeing here, not only the asphalt, but the roadway system. We have the asphalt at 25 and 5. And when you're going to get to the point of resurfacing the asphalt, you redo your concrete swale down the middle of the driveway. So just trying to plan in advance to help you have a good plan at your association.
Yeah, that's a great way to make sure that everybody is on the same page. Another way we can affect our planning is we're phasing out a project. Sometimes projects can be split up into different phases so that we're not doing everything at once. If you've ever dealt with maybe a developer turning things over in phases, same kind of principle. What's a good example we can give them here, Robert?
Roofing broken down. Yeah, we've got flat roof, the center portion, the east portion. Those are on the same cycle, 15 and 2. And looks like north and south are on the same cycle, 15 and 8. And the flat roof is all by itself, but put together some basic modules here. But overall, for all the buildings here at the association, I think 5 buildings, split them up into 2 type of categories, the 15 and 2s and the 15 and 8s.
Yeah, so those 2 are good examples of, hey, sometimes we put things together to make it a little more easy, and sometimes we break things apart for economic reasons. Another way we can break things apart is by providing an allowance. We don't have a need to replace everything at once. Maybe we can do an annual allowance over time. This component here for the gutters is a great example of that. Yeah, you got your gutters and downspouts. We'll split them up. We'll give an allowance every year. It still goes into the reserve fund, but it's a way to kind of spread out the cost and make it a little more palatable for the homeowners.
Yeah, but this one, I can see it clearly on my view, but we're not doing all the gutters, but every 5 years, we're going to do a chunk. So every 5 years, we don't know which ones, which places, but every 5 years, it seems like a reasonable pattern at this association to dive in and do some gutter work.
One of the things that's maybe a little also challenging to see on this view is what's important. It's important when you have a plan to have your priorities set up. I think one of our tables, our significance table, was probably one of my favorites to look at to kind of figure that out.
I like that. Okay, here's the significance table. I just want to let everyone see that there's tables here that show just exactly what we did show. The list of components, all those kinds of things. But you look and see, well, yeah, some of the projects are big and expensive, some are small. But Mark's point, which ones are important, that's what you get here.
Yeah, I like this view because it brings my eyes quickly when I look at these percentages to what is really driving the reserve fund. You can go back and forth on some of the components and they take up a lot of your time. And I think this really helps to prioritize. Boards are busy. They're busy people. It's a volunteer basis. This isn't their full-time job. And I think it's important to make sure that folks know, what the priorities are and what their attention needs to be on.
Yeah, I'm looking at this one. You can see that there's a few projects. The irrigation controller is almost nothing. Trash gates are almost nothing. But boy, makes it real clear that stucco, wood shingle siding, partial replacement, those add up. That's 8.5, the 27, 37 and 36% of all reserve funds are going to the building envelope here, the siding type projects. What's some other big ones? Oh, roofing, of course. 11 plus 3 plus 2 plus another 3% here, 3% here for the west building. Now that's adding up to 20-ish%. Plumbing is a big deal at this association. Termite treatment is a big deal. Because you might even think that termites just an afterthought. But 8% of all the reserve funds are going to termite treatment. It's not that big of an expense, but it happens every 12 years. And so that makes it more significant because although plumbing is a very expensive project, it only happens every 30 years. So this brings that into perspective.
Yeah, I think it's just a good way to show how useful this U-Planet tool is. I think what most people are worried about when they look at a reserve study is the dollar amounts. What do you think we can look at some funding for these folks here, Robert?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, let's pop over to, let's start with the control panel, how much money they have. They have a little bit under $300,000 to start with, and default with 1% interest, 3% inflation. And we go to the recommendations page and start to look at what their plan is. Just under $4,900 a month with a 3% gradual increase in their funding every year. And you can see that pretty much no expenses in the first year, but the expenses start to mount in the 5, 6, 7, 8 year range. And that's what they're up against. So what do you want to do?
Well, this is probably what we're looking at as the full funding plan. Let's take a look at what a baseline funding might look like.
Okay, baseline funding is, for those of you new, baseline funding is just barely to be cash positive. So if you're taking notes, write down $4,890 per month to fully fund the reserves, to have that margin we spoke about earlier. But if you want to baseline fund, which means just have enough cash that you stay above zero, down to $3,660 per month. And so it's a lower, you're putting less into the reserve fund, but look at all the years that you're down below 30% funded. Those are the years that there's a pretty fair chance you're going to get hit with a special assessment. Again, because the costs are there. There's no avoiding the costs. If you're too optimistic in your planning and you don't have the money, cash in reserves, you're going to need a special assessment. So the cash is there, costs are fixed, just a choice of how you pay for it.
Yep. I always like to look at the baseline funding because I want to know where it is and I want to have a good concept of where the bottom is, but baseline funding is not typically my goal.
Yeah. We like to point our clients towards a safe future. And if you remember those charts earlier, we don't like our clients down in the 0 to 30% range. We like them in, you could almost say that it's evening out the funding to, you can't see it, it's the full funding button is right there. I'm going to have to change the zooming. There we go. There we go. So 3660 to 4890, that's about where this association needs to be in their budgeting.
Yeah, I think it's good that they know their upper limit and they know their lower limit. One thing that helps to know is because things change. We're not fortune tellers, can't see everything that's going to happen in the future. One of the things that we all know can fluctuate pretty regularly is inflation. We can take a look at how that can really affect a community's funding plan. Robert, let's try 5% and see what happens.
Okay, we had a few years of very high inflation recently. And the question here, is it going to be 5% inflation for all 30 years, which that's what we're going to do here, or we're going to use a different number, but watch what a big change this makes. Okay, we save that, go back here, and instead of 3% inflation, if we assume 5% inflation, that plan that so nicely was a full funding plan a moment ago is going to end up crashing and burning.
Yeah, it's important to note that we don't expect 3% or 5% inflation over the next 30 years, but it is good to be able to play with the numbers and see what happens if inflation stays high a little bit longer term.
Hey, let's set this back to normal and then want to play with interest?
Yeah, let's see what interest can do. I've seen some pretty high yield bearing interest accounts, but let's say maybe 3.5%, maybe 4% interest.
Let's go for it. Let's save that. Move over here to recommendations. Wow, that 4890 that was only getting you to fully funded, look how that overshoots now when you add the help of the bank to get all that extra interest. So one thing I like to do, that was 4890. What's now a full funding plan? 4220. So 4890 to 4220 is $670. So you ask yourself, is it worth the time spent going to the bank and getting some higher interest bearing vehicles for your reserve funds? The answer is clearly yes. That's an extra $670 a month for your association. And how much money does this place have? They have almost $300,000. And look here, they're not going to be spending all of that until 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. So yeah, it's probably pretty safe for them to tie up a bunch of it in a higher interest bearing savings account.
Yeah, I think the homeowners can be responsible and talk to a financial planner, make sure that the accounts that they've got, they can withdraw when they need them. And yeah, do some good things for your homeowners. I think that they'd really appreciate that. 300,000 seems like a lot of good starting cash. What if we didn't have quite that much coming in?
Okay, what do you say? What number?
Knock off another 100. Let's say 192 instead of 292.
Okay, they were what? Weren't they about 70% funded?
Mm-hmm.
I think they were. Okay, so what happens here? Ooh, yeah, they get a little dangerous. So they are 47% funded, so they're in that middle range here. And that future looks so rosy at 4220. Now it doesn't look so rosy to fully fund. It's going to be about 4670. Yeah, so just a bunch of trade-offs here. When you have less cash to start with, it's almost like getting on the freeway. If you start real slow, you have to step on the gas pretty hard to get up to freeway speed. And this association, we started them with $100,000 less. And they're going to need to stand on the accelerator a little bit with higher reserve transfers for a little while to build up the strength of their reserve fund.
Let's make it really tough on them. Let's say it's 92.
Oh, yikes. What did you have for breakfast today? Okay. 92, they crash and burn. And that's still, okay, now we get into some complications. They don't want to be tying their cash up too much because with only 90 some grand and they have, no, they'll be okay. They'll be okay for at least 1 year. But let's see what the model says. Yeah, the model is recommending a special assessment.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring that out because I think that there's a good opportunity to show that there's a couple different ways we can do this. And this isn't that uncommon. I think most associations are probably not where they need to be to start. And so it's not totally uncommon to see, especially if it's your first reserve study, come in lower than you thought you were going to be. And so we have some tools to move them up. Let's talk about an exercise plan first.
Okay. Hey, I want to do one thing here. We've got 34 units, right? Let's make this a $34,000 special assessment instead of 38 something. And it's,
big
it's pretty much the same. Yeah, nice round number. This helps you as a board member be able to politically explain to the owners that since we don't have so much money in reserves, it's going to cost us $1,000 a piece. And they scream, how can that be? And because of years and years of not setting aside enough reserves. But look at here. Your expenses don't start for another year or 2 or 3. So maybe you don't need that $34,000 right now. How about we divide that in 2? $17,000 the first year, $17,000 the next year. Watch here, see if we're still okay. Yep, we're still okay. And you've cut the special assessment in half, spread it out over 24 months instead of 12 months. So again, like my mom would say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And this is what you can do with You Plan It. So eliminate the special assessments. Try.
Right. Let's see. Yeah, we can see what happens.
Okay. Without the special assessments, we know there's going to be trouble. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Mark was our slang for starting low and getting higher. We call it the exercise plan. So let's say that instead of 3% annual increases, we go with 10% annual increases. We've got to start grabbing some reserve cash, setting some reserve cash aside. Let's try that for 5 years. And then let's recalculate and see that 10% annual increase. And great. That got us through the trouble year, actually got us too far. So maybe we only need that for even less. Nice. Okay. And now we can start trying to do more fancy things to turn the curve over. But you could start with 4,900 and a couple of steps of progress, and you'll get successfully through this pinch of high expenses.
Yep. And every association is going to be unique, and they're all going to have unique needs. So it's important that we understand the tool, understand the options, make sure that we're able to work within, following good business judgment rules and how to operate our association.
I like that. Let's get back to the agenda. So that was the Townhome Association, how we look at things, how we look at the funding, the influences of different factors.
At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you want to join us in this mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below on what you'd like to see us address in a future video. Let's plan for your best future.